Alrighty, welcome to NycosRPG. I'm Jonathan Alban, and we are talking about a full show today. If you haven't been with us on a Friends Day before, Friends Day is Wednesday, and generally I try to take some time of my own to connect with my friends. And today I spent some time with some playlists, and this series fits in well with the Game Master's Toolbox playlists. So if you get a chance, check out those videos and keep updated on how I am trying to help you make your games more excellent at your table. Alrighty, so in today's soapbox arena, we're going to talk a bit about. Let's see if I have it set up. I do. We're going to talk about the concept of the Grolem, and this is a Nikos specific creature, so we're actually talking about the very mechanics of which we've talked about before in a practical sense. We're going to look at the creation of a species and how that process really needs to be played off against the rest of your created world in a particular way. So we're going to be talking about the origins of the species, the purpose of the species, how it interacts with the world, and what you do to, for example, handle and deal with population control, population expansion agendas, and that kind of thing. So before we get into that, let's go back over to the toolbox. And we're going to be talking about the proper use of meta monsters in the toolbox arena. Now, we are going to go back and talk about how it applies to creating your world, but I want to start right here with the idea of creating a meta monster. Now, I utilize the term meta monster to refer to those beings, those creatures in the game's story that by necessity can't be changed, altered, or converted. They are simply what they are. And in doing so, I'm realizing I'm opening up a bigger can of worms than perhaps most game masters are even thinking about, and many story writers have been thinking about and wrestling with for a long time. So this idea of the meta monster derives from the idea of those things that are outside of the realm of play. The concept of the meta game, in other words, the parts where what you have to think about the story isn't necessarily directly related to the story itself. Pardon me. Fighting with a head cold, so I know that's really pretty, so I'm sure that'll get me lots of ratings right there. But the first thing we have to talk about when we're talking about a meta creature is that the creature you're going to be talking about is something that will, in the game term, be disposable. And that is a dangerous thing when you're dealing with the very idea of killing. Now, I know that I'm talking about this in a way that perhaps hasn't been considered before, but when you are an adventurer in a role-playing game, you certainly have this mental picture, at least, of wading through swaths of enemies, encountering numberless foes, and wailing away with your great sword and perhaps your flail or whatever, and just pummeling opponents into unalive status, so to speak. And this understanding of the meta monster really does give or afford the storyteller the means to do this without compromising virtue. In ancient times, they didn't even consider the nature of an enemy. They just knew the enemy was a threat, and therefore the alpha, the lizard brain of our structure, set forth to protect ourselves at the cost of whatever we were facing. So when you look at, for example, Lord of the Rings, and they're referring to the massive number of goblins and orcs and whatever, there's no conversation ever about the intrinsic morality of those monsters. They are simply outside of the parameters of reason. You are not going to negotiate with the forces of Sauron. You may arguably discuss things with the commanders. You may argue that you have the conversation with the mouth of Sauron, for example, in the case of Aragorn late in the Fellowship of the King. Return of the King. But that conversation is never about whether or not a given goblin or orc has virtue or has a family. There's no consideration at all about any of that. The fact that they speak of breeding goblin men is dissociative. There's no direct connection between that process and the beings that they're fighting on this in the streets and in the battles that they engage in. And this lack of association, this disconnection, is done, I believe, for a twofold reason. Again, pardon me. The first is that we want to be able to have those visual scenes of Aragorn swinging his sword through the battle and engaging many enemies and defeating them, pushing them back. And you can get down to the microcosmic of the actual individual swings, such as you do in role-play games, but the mechanics of the story demand the death of those monsters. Dungeons and Dragons is built on the idea that you defeat a monster by ending its existence. And this is somewhat problematic because when you do it in that kind of a fashion, you take away the humanity of all species. You relegate them to a subhuman status. And I think this may be, in some ways, what our culture has done to itself over time, is that we have gotten to the point where we have desensitized our position to the point where we cannot see our enemies as anything other than meta monsters. We can't see the sentience of them. So when we look at this, we have to realize that we are actually intentionally building a disposable species. We are trying to create almost a what's the word I'm looking for? A MacGuffin for us to push around, beat up, destroy, eliminate, because they are so foul and so insensitive and so other that they cannot be communicated with. They can't be comprehended. In essence, what we have to do is realize that to do so, we have to create a definite strategy for dealing with the meta beings. This concept of a meta monster is something that we are ascribing certain humanistic characteristics to make them dangerous, but then we are then stripping from them the rational capacity to be other than they are. And in order for that to work, we have to therefore, as I said, maintain a specific strategy when dealing with them. So phrases that we have in our culture today, the only good orc is a dead orc, the idea that kill them all, let God sort them out, those are otherizing phrases, and we've used them on human beings time and again in our culture. And so when we are a world builder and a game creator, we have to establish lines of parameter, or else we allow the persona, the players in the characters that the players are portraying, to become desensitized to the possibility or the capacity for social interaction that might change them. A great example that occurs in my games on a regular basis is that the primary species are all sentient, they are all communicative. And so even somebody who might be considered to be an opponent or an enemy nonetheless can be communicated with. You can actually make an effort to try to negotiate with most of them. But a meta monster, in order for it to effectively work as a disposable being, has to, by nature, not be communicative. You have to make sure you don't anthropomorphize the meta monster too much, or else you blur that line and suddenly now you have to have almost a metagame conversation about the very concept of elimination. In the world of Nikos, the game mechanism doesn't actually directly deal with damage to a player or a creature unless that creature has already foregone its sentience and is only there to deal damage. So, therefore, the players can clearly define for themselves by the actions of the monsters whether the monster is something that is sentient and able to be talked to, or if it merely is a meta monster that can be killed without compunction. The reason for this is that you have to be able to associate the very idea of communication and negotiation if a being is sentient. Otherwise, you have to make the decision that the actual killing of that enemy is substantiable, that you can somehow find it in yourself the capacity to actually kill another being. And that can have very long implications when you're dealing with players. So, having said that, when we're speaking of the development of a meta monster, what we are saying is that they can't be personalized. If you look into the eyes of, for example, a Grolem, which we're going to talk about in particular in a moment, but when you look into the eyes of a Grolem, you do not see something that is aware of you at all. That it's simply reacting to its environment, its condition, and therefore its desires and focus are purely on that animalistic or lower mindset. They simply can't be rationalized with. This also means that you can describe the combat scenes in literally senseless terms because the beings that are involved and engaged in the action are not reasoning. There is no thought being put into what they are doing. They are simply acting, and therefore, by keeping them at that arm's reach and keeping from anthropomorphizing that villain or that monster, you're allowing for it to be dispatched with impunity because it's not sentient. And I think that this is really important when you look at the story of Lord of the Rings, the countless foes of the armies of the Rohirrim or the forces of Gondor. When you are facing against the orc tribes, they are doing absolutely senseless things like throwing the heads of their defeated enemies over the walls to demoralize them. Well, the very thought of grabbing someone's head and putting it in a catapult does seem absolutely irrational and seems impossible to consider if you are instead the receiver of that. And so your ardor and strident desire to stop your enemy becomes greater because they are doing truly senseless acts of violence. And role-play games, by definition, generally have a considerable amount of violence in them. Now, I would argue that in the realms of Nikos, a lot of the nuances of the villainy that occurs has changed because so many of the enemies of the adventurers are themselves sentient, and therefore they are more sensible in terms of the negative actions that they take. But when it comes to the few times that the players do engage with the meta creatures, the meta monsters, I try to leave most of that to their imagination rather than building any precise, detailed information into those scenes because it isn't intended to be, you're not looking into a certain room to see who caused or who did the murder. It's obvious that the destruction was done in a wanton fashion, and therefore you don't have to pursue the details of why the monsters acted the way they did. They simply acted. So when we are therefore talking about a meta monster, we're talking about something that is not sentient, not intentional, not permanent in any way. Instead, they are those creatures that can be dispatched in the story, and that makes them therefore useful in the storytelling. So now let's see, did I go here or there? Not there, we went here. Oop. I'm all over the place. There we go. So now we're going to talk about the Grolem in particular. As a mechanical structure in world creation, this is actually making of a meta monster. So I just want to clarify that we're not talking about building something that has a deep and abiding culture at all. So let me tell you the origins of the Grolem story. We'll talk about the meanings of such a monster, the need there for us to have the surrogates of meta monsters, and then relating it to the actual consciousness and the purpose of role-play games. So before I walk through all of my outline, let's go ahead and go over there. So, oops. All right. So, in the case of the Grolem, the first thing to realize is that I've been a game master for 50 years, which means that from the very day one, I knew what an orc was, and I had read Lord of the Rings, so I knew that they were bad guys, that they were monstrous in nature. But less than a year after I started game mastering, the Player's Handbook for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons became available, and in picking up that book and reading, I noticed that there was a section on a species type that was allowed to be played called the half-orc. And to me, that was weird, because they had clearly defined the orc as a bad guy, and so now they've got them listed. Now, in the defense of the half-orc, the concept of it was originally rather abominable. It was literally talking about the descendant of a rutting orc and his prey during one of the raids. And it's unconscionable to think of today. As a matter of fact, Dungeons and Dragons in the last year or two has eliminated all of the half species for the same reason, to get rid of the muddiness of interspecies sexuality. I know that seems like a weird place to go, but they were literally looking for a way to eliminate the darker side of those trysts. So the reason for my developing of the meta monster known as the Grolem was at first immediately to get a new disposable monster. I had players who were playing half-orcs, and therefore the senseless killing of their relatives seemed a bit too much. The idea of defeating the rampant raiding orcs make perfect sense, because the random raiding orcs aren't doing so because they are intentional. They are instead doing it because it is in their nature to do so. But therefore, you have to divorce that if you are having people play as half-orc, because otherwise you are giving license to that level of violence. And I wanted to make sure we separated that. So the idea was, now we're going to have a new disposable monster. Now, I'm going to jump down a bit. These beings were considered in my worldview to be old order conduit, and in particular for Amba. The idea is that these were elemental beings that could interact with earth, rock, soil, and do magical effects in that vein as part of their being, because they were meta. They were not a sentient species, but simply they were literally forming out of the rocks, and so therefore I could have fundamentally innumerable foes without having to deal with their individual species, individual origin stories. They just simply formed out of the rocks. Now, as far as their appearance over time, they took on a more goat-like appearance, but they were really monstrous beasts, and they were carnivorous, capricious, and cruel. The reason why they ended up in the goat shape in story was that they were devastating in their destruction. So they would go into a town and wipe the town out, even to the point of destroying their libraries. And if you look at the story elements of things like the rook, they could be instructed on picking up the orcs. You could have them, pick up library books or pick up tomes and documents because they were instructable. In this case, I wanted them to be devastatingly destructive, so therefore they would literally eat any literature that they found. And that was fundamentally how I justified their ability to use magic, simply because they were consuming magical materials in the process of the destruction that they were doing. Now they ranged all over the Grolantor Highlands. If you've seen my maps, there are 3 fundamental continental masses that are all conjoined in the middle. But the what's now known as the Western continent is Grolantor, and the use of Grolim was really kind of a whitewash. It was a mechanism that I could put disposable monsters anywhere in the story around where the players were acting, so that if they went on a wandering encounter, then I would have something that I could throw at them. And it really was fundamentally a surrogate villain, because even at that point I was looking at and admiring some of the elements of Tolkien's approach to the what he referred to as the Uruk-hai, the goblin men hybrids that were far more intelligent, far more interactive, and I wanted therefore to allow the elevation of the orc species, so that those people that were playing half orcs no longer had to deal with the negative aspersions that were being cast upon them by the very story elements that were in place at the time. I didn't preclude a player from playing a species simply because I disagreed with its origins, but rather I came up with ways to make that work. And so creating a surrogate villain to replace the orcs allowed for the orcs to become the Uruk-hai, but then of course I'm trying not to associate directly with another person's IP, so they became known as the Auruk, and then now are the Rook, and then of the Rook there are 2 subspecies, the Auruk and Maruk, but we'll go into that later. The idea here, though, is that the Grolim were specifically designed to replace them and became my fundamental Western meta creature. Now we'll talk at a later time about the other species of Nykos that are meta beings, but the idea here is that the Grolim became the methodology for handling that part of storytelling and still allowing my players the much vaunted requirement, if you will, to indiscriminately kill monsters. We wanted to have the capability of doing that, but I had to, in my own mind, reconcile that away from the player interacting with sentient beings and treating them with that level of disdain. So now that you've got an understanding of the Grolim story, let's talk about the real meaning of a monster. Remember, a monster, as we've talked about before, is a creature that only desires destruction. Now, there are nuances. I know there are lots of people who associate villainy with monstrosity, and that's an argument perhaps for another day. But the idea here is that the idea of a monster being destructive gives way to allow the players, therefore, to be equally destructive with impunity. There's nothing wrong with hunting a monster if it's dealing the kind of damage. And we really, in terms of elevating the mindset of a player from mere simple destruction, which exists rampantly in almost every role-play game out there. It's all about killing the monsters and destroying the bad guys and, taking them down, taking them out. The idea here is that we want to be able to create a surrogacy mechanism so that the players can still maintain the higher ground when it comes to negotiating and discussion. If you look at historicity, you look at the individuals who write down what happened in the past. They, as the saying goes, to the victor go the spoils, and to the history books goes the person who won, because he writes the histories. With that allows for the rationalization of doing bad things to other sentient beings. And I believe that from a role play standpoint, we want our players to not delve into that level of destructiveness if we can help it at all. And so the need for surrogates is rampant, and therefore I make as many different species types monstrous so that the players have those things to vet their frustration, carry out the catharsis of the actual demise of enemies, and the need that is built into role-play games to kill things. Now, I believe there's an unspoken hierarchy of death, and most game masters probably already know what I'm talking about here. And the idea is that when you are building out your story, you certainly are picking out those rooms or those places in the story where the players can exert their catharsis and exert their lethality with impunity. You're not going to be calling them up on charges, for example, for doing so. But realizing there's an unspoken hierarchy, if the players happen to cross that line and take action against other sentient beings, is there a mechanism in place in your game for you as a storyteller to adjudicate that? Or is it frontier justice, whatever happened, happened? And there's nothing wrong, I suppose, with pursuing either direction. But from my standpoint, with 50 years of experience as a game master, the allowance of such action without ramification, in a way, tends to send the wrong message to the players, because they begin to see the destruction of everything or anything being of no value, whereas you really, from a storytelling standpoint, want them to hold the story elements as valuable so that they will pursue that direction, that guidance. So, having said that, therefore, we want to talk a little bit about the monster's motivation. As I've said, in the case of the meta, those beings that are not sentient, those beings that have only the destructive agenda, it becomes easy, because then you have to develop a story for what's going on that explains why they are there. But the very desire for them to destroy makes them eligible for the destruction that will be visited upon them by the players. And this process is really what we have to talk about. So when we are talking about your game world, your worldview, when you are building out the adventure for your players, you need to kind of flesh out, do you have any meta monsters? Do you have a means for the players to engage with the story that is not destructive, so that they do have a means or a pathway to conversation and communication, and perhaps changing the minds of the villains? If not, it's perfectly possible. I mean, if you look at, again, Sauron had one agenda. He was going to destroy Middle Earth. He was going to make it all his own, and he was going to dominate and control. But he was operating, at least until the player characters, the primary characters in the story, engaged him. He was operating with the understanding that all of his creatures were meant to kill and destroy, and there was no redeeming quality. It's only when the need for thinking like sentient beings caused him to even elevate the Orc to the Uruk-hai, to therefore give them the opportunity to assess their enemies. And therefore, in the meta, the Lord of the Rings does set up the potential, at least, for even had Frodo not been successful in destroying the ring, nonetheless, the very idea that there are now Easterlings and Uruk-hai in the story give the opportunity for there to be discussion that might lead to an eventual peace. Now, that's, of course, never addressed, never concerned, because we simply destroyed the ring and the power is gone for the enemy and the world goes back to being controlled by rational men. But the idea that you create a meta monster gives your players opportunity and a place for them to exert their destructive nature without forfeiting the higher ground in the meta. Having said that, I do want to talk, let's see, anything else that I wanted to talk about? No, I think that's pretty much the topics I want to talk about. Oh, no, here we go. No, I've already gone over these. It's been a day. I had, like I said, a great morning this morning, and got a chance to go talk to Scott, and all of that went really well. So I do want to thank you for being here. Do remember, if you haven't heard before, NycosRPG is a game mechanic that is available at NycosRPG.com. There are downloadable versions of a fast play mechanism, so you can learn about how to create monsters within the setting. You can build a persona with some of the basics and rudimentary character species and all of that, so you can develop an understanding of how the game works. In addition, there is a website, NycosRPG.info, that carries a ton of lore about the story of the world of Nykos, so you can kind of get your feet wet there. And if you want to become part of our community, do check out patreon.com/Nykos. And once you become a member there and a supporter of our work, you then get the opportunity to play in our groups on Saturday and Sunday via Discord. More information is available about that at patreon.com/Nykos, NYCOS. So I want to thank you again for being here. I hope to see you again in the next episode. Remember, we do broadcast 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific time, Monday through Friday. So we have more episodes coming to you this week. In the meantime, get a chance, watch our videos, especially take in the NycosRPG Game Master's Toolbox and catch up on all of the things that will help your game become better. Thank you so much for being here, and we will see you again next time.